Vicki Parker. Good evening, everyone. My name is Vicki Parker, and I'm the Community Development Director for the city. And I want to welcome everybody to the first of several community meetings we're going to be having in conjunction with our housing element update. So this is our sixth cycle update, and it's going to cover the period of 2023 through 2031. So our current housing element planning period, operational period ends in 2022. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to provide really a basic context for the work that we'll be doing with the update, along with a timeline for that work plan, so that everyone knows what's coming and knows the important points for them when they want to check in. And we want to, because there are always varying levels of experience in the community of housing element work. Some of you have participated in many of them. Some of you, this will be the first time. So we wanted to provide a basic context for what a housing element is, why it's important to you, and like I said, a timeline associated with that. So we're kind of thinking of this, of tonight, as the Novato Housing Element 101 type programming. So we want to give you the context. We're going to have a presentation by the city's consulting team and follow that with opportunities for the participants we have tonight to answer questions, or excuse me, to ask questions and get those answered. The meeting tonight will be recorded, and it's going to be available online on our Housing Element Update webpage. So if you or your neighbors aren't able to participate fully tonight, you can get that 101 education through the recording, and then we'll give you, at the end of tonight's presentation, we'll give you ways that you can stay connected with the effort. So again, I'm Vicki Parker. I want to introduce the team that's with us tonight. Sorry, David, can you stop sharing just so folks can put a face with a name? Thank you. First off, we have Steve Marshall. Steve is our Planning and Environmental Services Manager, and he will be helping facilitate public questions tonight. And from our consultant for this effort is Lisa Wise Consulting, and our director and project manager is David Bergman. David, maybe you just want to raise a hand. Thank you, David. We also have Henry Pontarelli. Henry, if you want to just give a wave, and Ethan Stan. So got a good team of folks with us tonight. Going to take us through your presentation, like I said. We have about 90 minutes set aside for the meeting tonight. So we'll do a quick time check after the presentation, see kind of the volume of questions that we have and how much time we should allot for each of those questions. So with that brief update, I want to hand it over to David so he can get started and we can save more time for questions and answers. All right, go ahead, David.
Jump the gun there a little bit on the screen share, just because we're really pleased to be starting here and pleased to have the opportunity to introduce ourselves and to begin the process of learning more about the City of Novato and its housing needs and ways to plan for the sixth cycle housing cycle. So to next slide here. Again, you saw I had an opportunity to meet your community development director, Vicki Parker, and her associate, planning services manager, Steve Marshall. And again, our team is myself, Dave Bergman, joined with Ethan Stan, and our vice president of the firm, Henry Pontarelli. And Henry, you might want to say a few words, just a little bit about LWC and what the work we've been doing, just to set a little bit of context.
Yeah, really briefly, I just wanted to thank Vicki and staff and entire community for this opportunity. We've been at this for about 16 years. We have between the fourth, fifth, and sixth cycles, we have about 36 housing element updates under our belt, about 14 in this cycle. And we really appreciate the opportunity to work in Novato, particularly the city is dedicating a lot of time and resources to the community engagement effort. This is the first of first of two workshops. And the outreach effort also will include stakeholder interviews, online survey, study sessions with the Planning Commission and the City Council, public hearings, the City Council, and there's a dedicated web page that's going to be constantly updated. As Vicki indicated, it's going to have it's going to hold the video log of this meeting. And then throughout the process, you're going to be able to contribute, participate by submitting comments to the housing element at novato.org. That's going to flash up on the screen a number of times. Hang tight. And again, we just appreciate the opportunity and look forward to learning the highest priorities that community has.
Thank you, Henry. As Vicki mentioned, we really wanted to provide an overview of the housing element process and where we are on some of our first initial steps, just to lay a context for the beginning of an extended conversation with the community. The city has anticipated through our scope of services a very robust outreach program. So there'll be lots of opportunities for you and your neighbors and for community organizations to participate. And it's not just because it makes a better plan to have your input, but housing elements, as we'll find out, are in this conversation, are very much governed by state law. And one of the components of state law is that it requires a diligent public outreach process, which is the highest standard in the government code. So we want to be as engaged with you and to hear your concerns, ideas, recommendations, and thoughts throughout this whole process. And not only do we hear them, but as this process unfolds, we want to make sure that you know how they're reflected in the documents that are produced. So today's conversation is really going to center around 5 primary topics. First is an overview of the housing element process, a review of some of our existing conditions here in Novato, so that so we have a sort of a common understanding of what some of the challenges, opportunities, and context for housing in the city are. Talking about a new requirement in the 6th cycle. So some of you may have participated 8 years ago in the 5th cycle, and there have been a lot of changes. We'll talk about them, but one of the most significant ones is a state requirement that all elements of the housing element, that all of these actions work together in an integrated fashion to further the goals of fair housing. So this is something that's new, and it's very central to the housing element. A little bit more updates on community engagement. And again, as part of this process, we want to make sure that there's a diligent public engagement effort. And then finally, a wrap up, next steps, and an opportunity for you to ask us some questions, both of staff and of the consulting team. So housing elements, by the way, are required by state law, and they come about in an 8-year cycle. This is the 6th cycle. They have their origin actually in fair housing legislation that started originally in the federal government with the Fair Housing Act from 1965 and eventually promulgated out to the states. The state of California wanted to make sure that all local governments that have land use authorities, so cities and counties, plan for their fair share of anticipated housing growth, and to acknowledge the fact that the housing market in California and in our system primarily housing is produced by the private sector, by private investment, and for both market rate and affordable housing. So to have programs in place that help to facilitate the goals of making sure that enough housing is produced to accommodate the growth needs of the state of California. So the housing element is a little bit different. So for some of you may have participated, I know Novato recently updated its general plan, and it's an unusual part of the general plan. So state general plan law requires that there are certain elements in a general plan that are required by law. For example, the land use element. The zoning code implements the land use element. You have a mobility element, a conservation element, open space, safety, noise. And communities can choose to add other elements as well, like economic development or historic resources. And there's a lot of creativity that communities can have in the general plan process. The state really wants to try and give communities as broad of a canvas for which they can chart their vision. The one exception to that spirit of creativity is unfortunately the housing element. The housing element is very strictly prescribed in state law as to what it needs to contain, what analyses need to be included, and almost what conclusions it needs to reach. And towards this end, it's important to recognize that the housing element is the only element of the general plan that it requires certification by the state that the city is in compliance with all of the requirements of state law as it relates to housing. So it's a little bit different than other general plan elements. Again, as I mentioned, it's a required section of the city's general plan. It needs to look at the existing conditions and assess the oncoming needs for housing in the community. It needs to establish a plan by ensuring that there's enough space that is appropriately zoned to accommodate that future demand for housing, and that it sets citywide goals, objectives, policies, and programs, and uses the housing element adoption process to ensure conformance with state law. So again, there are certain sections that are required in a housing element. The first is a review of the existing policies and programs, a sense, a kind of scorecard of how you did over the last 8 years in terms of meeting the objectives that the city set out for itself in its adopted housing element. The next is a housing needs assessment, and that's a review of the socioeconomic and demographic conditions in the city, and a review of how well those social demands are being met by the existing housing stock in the city. Then there's an analysis of housing constraints, and this is very important. There are 3 levels to those constraints. The first are governmental constraints. The state is requiring every city to look through its zoning codes, its development processes and procedures, and to identify any constraints that through government action are slowing down the production of housing. And once they're identified, to develop programs to address them. Now, again, government is a facilitator of housing production in California. The primary driver is the private sector. So it's important to look at market constraints. These are things that the City of Novato doesn't control. The price of land, interest rates, the availability of financing, these kinds of issues that influence the production of housing, both in the community, the region, and the state as a whole. And the third section is environmental, particularly in terms of identifying any specific conditions in the community's physical or natural environment that may be impeding housing development. In some cases, that might be areas where there have been environmental degradation over time, or there might be sensitive areas, ecologically sensitive, any number of difficulties with slopes, those kinds of things, all need to be identified. Then there is the adequate sites inventory, and there's usually a lot of attention paid to the sites inventory, and we'll be working with the community and with staff to identify where the sites are that can accommodate the housing that has been allocated to Novato by the state. We'll talk a little bit about how that process works. And again, there's a requirement that housing is provided at for availability for low-income populations, and we'll talk about what that is, moderate income, and above moderate or market rate. Again, new to the sixth cycle is an analysis of fair housing. Sometimes we'll hear it referred to as AFFH, which is the affirmatively furthering fair housing is what it stands for. It's a mandate that every jurisdiction in California has now in their housing elements, this AFFH. Then finally, a housing resources assessment that looks at what available funding programs are available at the state, federal, and local level to help implement housing. And then finally, programs and an implementation plan with a timeline and quantifiable objectives that lists out the actions that the city will take over the housing cycle to help facilitate the production of units. So what is this? And I'm sure for the casual listener has maybe come across this term and wondered what it means. It's pronounced RHNA, even though there's no way that you would get that from there. It's the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And what the RHNA is a number of housing units that a city is targeted with showing or required to show that it can accommodate over the 8-year planning cycle. So notice I didn't say that the city must build or anyone in the private sector must build or it compels anything. This is in fact the obligation to accommodate this level of growth within the city's general plan and zoning code. So how it works is the state of California, Department of Finance, Department of Housing and Community Development, so both parts of the executive branch meet. They come up with a number of a statewide target for how many housing units they believe the state needs to grow over the next 8 years. That number then is disaggregated to all of the regions. In the Bay Area, that's ABAG, which is the Association of Bay Area Governments. And they're assigned a methodology. They're assigned to come up with a methodology that all of the member cities more or less need to agree to allocate their regional targets. And so that process has gone on and different regions choose different goals and objectives. In the Bay Area, there was a lot of emphasis placed on including housing growth in areas that hadn't experienced it in the last cycle and in high opportunity areas, areas that had especially beneficial socioeconomic outcomes and indicators. Those communities tended to get larger allocations, whereas communities with lower opportunities tended to have a smaller allocation. So the RHNA number for Novato over the 8 years is the need to show that the city can accommodate an additional 2,090 units. And those units need to be available to the different income levels that I had mentioned. So it calls for about 570 very low income units, 328 low income units, 332 moderate units, and 860 above moderate units. Now these terms, low, medium, high, a lot of times when people talk about affordable housing, they sort of understand what it means from their own experience, which is understandable. Affordable to whom? Affordable to me? Is it fairly priced? Is it unfairly priced? What does affordable housing actually mean? Well, there's a legal definition, and it's that legal definition that guides all of these decisions or requirements in the plan. And it's based off of the area median income, or AMI, and it's set at the county level. So for Marin County in 2021, the area median income is just a little under $150,000. So what this means is, depending on the size of the household, and usually most planning is done off of a 4-person household, to reach the threshold of moderate income, so between 80% and 120% of the area median income, a household of 4 needs to have an aggregate income of just under $180,000. Similarly, for low income, it's just a little over 145, so 146,000, and so on. So these thresholds are actually rather high, just given the fact that Marin County has higher incomes than many counties in California. So another important factor influencing the 6th cycle has been the adoption of some new laws. And I'm just going to highlight on a couple of them. One is this no net loss of housing. So during the entire 8 years of the housing cycle, the city has to maintain its capacity for all of the income limits within RHNA. This is the origin of the so-called buffer. Well, it's not legally required. HCD recommends that communities plan for more than their minimum RHNA amount, such that they can, if housing doesn't develop in the income category on the sites that have been identified, that it doesn't need to go out and find new sites and reopen that. So this obligation to be able to maintain no net loss of units through the planning cycle leads to this requirement, or recommendation, not a requirement, recommendation for a buffer over and above RHNA. A variety of other technical changes, and we can talk about those and what's important, and what some of them may be more or less relevant to Novato. So what does the housing element do? It creates programs to help implement the production of new housing. It undertakes actions to expand housing production for population at all income levels and removing constraints to the production of housing. And it ultimately needs to accommodate this RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So here we are in the process. Again, although this is the first time you're meeting us, we've been working away. Mostly with the technical assessment, gathering the data that we'll talk a little bit about, like the existing conditions in the city, preparing our understanding of the quantitative nature of the community, so that when we are prepared, when we come out and speak with you, that we get a better sense of the qualities of Novato and have those qualities and issues reflected into the to your plan that ultimately you adopt and have certified. So we plan a number of workshops, a number of study sessions, and community engagement throughout the entire process as we work towards a January 2023 deadline for submission of the draft housing element. Let's talk a little bit about some data, just so that we understand what we're looking at here, which is some quick statistics in terms of race and ethnicity. Non-Hispanic white populations, the largest single group in Novato, followed by Hispanic population, and then smaller amounts of other racial and ethnic groups. Median age is about the same as Marin County. Population per household, similar to the county. About 60, almost 70% of the houses are owner occupied. And it's a little bit older of a community in terms of the age of the housing stock. Only about 20% of the units were produced before 1960, whereas almost 40% in the county produced in that in that time period. The median household income in Novato is a little bit below the county median. So Novato's 2020 median household income was about 101, almost $102,000, whereas the county median was a little over 121,000. What this means, because county has these very high requirements or high income levels, is they're about 40%, almost half of the households, rather, 47%, 10,000 households in Novato are considered to be moderate income or less. So I think that's really important when we start talking about affordable housing. This is not just housing for an indigent population, although that's something we need to consider, right? Housing for persons who are experiencing homelessness. We're also talking about 10,000 households currently in Novato that are earning 80% of the area median income, about a little under half of all of the households that are currently in the community. So, yeah, and then again, just to put that into context, by the way, about how affluent Marin County is that the statewide median household income is $75,000, a little over. Okay, so I don't need to tell those of you who live in Novato that housing is expensive. Median home value in Novato was just, well, I don't want to say a hair under $1 million, but a little over 900,000 in December 2021. So that's the average, the middle priced home. So what does that mean in terms of some occupations or income's ability to pay for housing? So let's look at low income. So the whole low, which is the low, extremely low, and the very low. So 50% to 80%. That income limit would be for a two-person household, 117,000, and for a three-person household, over 130,000. So what that household could pay in rent is the maximum that they could pay in rent is about $3,000 per month, which is one, very expensive, and two, hard to find housing at that price point in Novato today. And if they were to purchase a house with a 5% down, given current interest rates right now, about a little under 3% on a 30-year mortgage, where people could afford about a $500,000 home. Well, compare that to the median price here in Novato of over 900,000. So even when you start to get to people in that 120 to 150% of the area median income, right? You still, for a household of three, are below the price, maximum purchase price for the median priced house today in Novato. They would stretch a three-person household earning 150% of AMI, significant income, right? $200,000, right? $200,000 respectable income. Three-person household still could not afford the median house in Novato. So we talk about cost burden, and cost burden is people who spend 30% or more of their income on their housing. And what's interesting about this is that usually it's common to see renters to have cost burden. So more than half of renters have cost burden. They're paying more than 30% of their monthly income on housing. And that is an unfortunate fact throughout California. What's interesting to me doing this work in cities across the state is how over a third, 34% of homeowners in Novato are cost burdened. Excuse me. What that tells me is that people are stretching their incomes, stretching their economic opportunities to be in this community. So that tells you that it's a desirable community and that people are willing to make sacrifices to invest in buying a home to be here in Novato. And by the way, that 30% is a national figure sort of set by HUD. It's a guideline that's used in housing planning for what people can afford. So we're also tasked with looking at special groups, including seniors and other populations, including female-headed households with children present, persons with disability. And what we're finding is that there are very high rates of cost burden among these special populations. So 60% of seniors are cost burden. There are almost 221 female-headed households with children present that are living below the federal poverty threshold in Nevada. So these are, people who are in the community today. And then about 10% of the population has either some sort of physical or cognitive disability. And again, we find that about 60% of the senior population is cost burden. Now, the reason why those groups are important is because we have this mandate now to affirmatively further fair housing, or AFFH. And AFFH, again, comes out of the civil rights era in a recognition that in the past there had been formal barriers to keep people on the basis of race and ethnicity from moving into different communities nationwide. But fair housing issues have come to expand beyond race and ethnicity, although we focus on that, to a whole variety of specialized populations that are protected or referred to as protected classes. These include seniors. These include, as I've mentioned, female-headed households with children present, large families, seniors, and persons with disability. So new to this thick cycle is this requirement that Novato, like all cities, make sure that it is affirmatively furthering the goals of providing housing for persons in this protected classes. So how do we go about doing that? And the state has issued clear guidance for what's required, including consultation with those groups. Again, it's very important that there's outreach. Outreach is at the core of a housing element. So an inclusive and equitable outreach to persons in that protective class. It's not enough just to post on the website, we're having a meeting. No, you have to affirmatively reach out to those communities and make sure that they understand that we need to hear their struggles or their issues with housing in Nevada. An assessment of the conditions of fair housing, concentrated areas of poverty, disparities to areas of access of opportunity, problems that special needs groups are having within the city. In smaller jurisdictions like Novato, this is usually not real pronounced in that there's a pretty homogeneous social geography, but we've worked in smaller cities where, historically, there's an ag town in Yolo County where we worked, where there was, a road that was a dividing line, and on one side of the road, that's where low-income migrant farm workers lived, and on the other side of the road, that's where the permanent population was. So assessing those kinds of historic trends. If they're not there, we have to just say that we've made a good faith effort to understand them. An analysis of that sites inventory that we talked about, which is the playing field as to where housing can be accommodated, to make sure that we're not concentrating lower income categories in areas of low opportunities. Understanding the contributing factors that have prevented fair housing in the past, and then coming up with goals and actions and policies to remediate any identified problems that these protected classes have in obtaining housing in Novato. So this is a good segue towards the end, which is to talk a little bit about community engagement. It is really important. We've stressed it, we'll continue to stress it, and we're really pleased that you all did take time out today to engage in what's important, but unfortunately, as the deeper you get into it, a very highly technical discussion about housing and housing programming and planning for Novato. We'll be holding community workshops. We'll be talking with various stakeholders. Then online survey will be made available. There'll be study sessions with the Planning Commission and City Council that will be noticed, Brown Act meetings. There'll be public hearings, adoption hearings later in the process. And there's always as a great resource, a good place to go to is a dedicated webpage that the city is maintaining, and we're going to provide information. And after our conversation today, we're going to put up not only just the recording of this meeting, but frequently asked questions. If there's some things that we can do to help answer your questions, undoubtedly those will be some of your neighbors' questions, and we'll want to make sure that that's up to date and current. And if you have thoughts, ideas, ways to improve it, concerns, whatever, through the entire process, we're accessible by email at a dedicated email address at housingelement@novato.org. So with next steps, we're going to continue outreach. We're going to be continuing our technical analysis, again, using input we heard today to help contextualize the numbers we've gathered. We want to learn more about Novato as a place. Through June and September, we'll be drafting the housing element, and the public review draft, which will be available for community discussion, will be scheduled to be issued this autumn. So again, we ask you to stay informed and involved at the website, and to sign up for our e-notifier services and stay informed. We really are counting on your participation to make this a successful project. So with that, we'll turn it over to Vicki and any questions that people in the community have.
Okay, thank you, David. Appreciate that very much. So we've got about an hour or 50 minutes. So that's great timing. Thank you, David, for going through that so quickly. So we're going to, why don't we do this? If everyone could just raise their hand real quickly. I've got a list of attendee names up in front of me. So if everyone could just raise their hand real quick, if you've got questions, that'll give us an idea of how much time we'll have to allot for each question. Doesn't mean you can't ask one later, but that way we know kind of how quickly we need to go. Okay, looks like we've got some shy folks on tonight, so not a whole lot of hands. So let's go ahead and get started. Steve's gonna facilitate the public input, and I'm gonna be taking a lot of notes, so you all see me with my head down quite a bit. Just means I'm writing. So questions are whatever's on your mind. Sometimes we'll have the question, or excuse me, have the answer already. Some of them we won't know until we're further into the process. So we'll let you know what we know right now. Okay, thanks. Let's go ahead and get started. Steve, I'll leave it up to you to call in. All right.
Our first person is Karen Anderson. Andreessen. I will allow you to talk now. You'll have to unmute yourself, Karen.
Okay, so when is the time going to be where we submit sites that we think would be appropriate for housing?
Oh, great question, Karen. You can submit those to the email address at any time that you want to. We've started already with our own analysis. There's sort of a series of filters that the state has that we need to put the sites through. So yeah, submit those to that email address as soon as you can, and we will add those into the mix.
Okay, is there like an end date that you want to have them by? Or
yeah, we're hoping to have our sites inventory pretty well buttoned up by late in the month of June, and that is primarily because we've got this additional AFFH set of filters that we need to run them through. So that's a separate consultant working for the county that is tasked with that. So we're trying to get the sites in there and through that filtering to see how it ends up where we stand with sites. So yeah, if you could get those to us in the next couple of weeks, it would be the best.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, our next commenter is Christy Saxton. So Christy, you can unmute yourself and speak now.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. Again, my name is Christy Saxton. I actually have two questions. One is about the outreach plan. Those of us in the know and work in housing, I think know very easily how to tap into this process. And I know there was a robust outreach plan discussed, but I'm curious to know is, how are you going to be reaching out to people who aren't readily in the know? You know, what is that outreach plan to folks that are just kind of have their heads down every day trying to do their jobs and raise their families and may not have their pulse on this, as some of us? So that's question one. My second question is, as some of us are aware, the point in time count numbers came out today, and there was over an 8% increase in homelessness in Marin County. And I'm interested in hearing about how you plan on ensuring that the housing element today is tied to the point in time count and how that will continue to stay nimble to evolve as every 2 years that point in time count comes out. How is that going to be addressed? And I know that point in time count is county-wide. I'm looking forward to seeing the jurisdiction numbers. But as we know, Novato has its fair share. And so how will you be tying that to affordable housing for our most vulnerable populations in the community?
Yeah, thanks, Christy. I'll take that first part of the question and then let the Lisa Wise team, I guess David, jump in if he has additional things to add. And then David, I'll let you take the point in time portion of that question. So Christy, just generally in terms of our outreach, we're relying heavily on our nonprofit and community organizations to help us reach those who, like you said, they're busy with their day-to-day lives and aren't tuned in. So several organizations have provided us with individuals and or folks working daily with those individuals. So that's how we're planning to do that. This meeting announcement went out to a robust group of folks around the community, 1,900 email addresses that we gleaned through various city functions. So definitely if you have suggestions for us, we're happy to take those. You can use that email address to hook us up to other organizations or other individuals that you would like us to reach out to. We're happy to take that. And David, if I could let you respond to the point in time count.
And the answer is it's in programs. You know, we have some state obligations to make sure that there are programs in place, for example, to allow group homes so that emergency and supportive housing can be cited. We have to make sure that the zoning code doesn't prevent or inhibit the development of permanent supportive housing in the city. And then other programs that, and this is where there is some room, depending on the commitment of the community, to have quantified objectives and programs that identify ways to address the unhoused population within Novato. And again, of its share or proportion of the Marin County. And we've done this in some other cities that we've worked in. They've included development of programs to allow for places where emergency tiny home, you know, to address the zoning code to allow for those kinds of placement on public or private, but in this case it was conceived as a public site, or safe parking locations. Some of that is based on the input we hear from the community about what its ideas and priorities are in that regard. And then the state holds us again to make sure that any constraints to the production of supportive housing are removed.
All right, thank you, David. We have another hand up here, Susan Stomp. Susan, you're now allowed to speak. Susan, are you on mute? So we're unable to hear Susan. So maybe we'll give Susan a chance to work out any technical issues on her end. And do we have anybody else who would like to ask questions? If so, please raise your hand. The raise hand function is at the bottom of your screen. It looks like we have some more folks. So we'll go next to Peter Tiernan. So we will allow Peter to talk.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. First of all, it's going to be quite a process. When it comes to environmental review, am I to assume that that constraints analysis that was discussed earlier would address that, whether it's traffic or water or what have you? And then secondarily, I noticed under the income categories, I had never seen it before, but I believe there's a new category, acute low income. And so if you could just talk to those two, please.
Thank you, Peter. David, I'll let you speak globally to that, and then Steve or I can jump in if we feel we need to add anything to it.
So there will be a CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act analysis, a programmatic EIR, and the programmatic EIR considers the effects to the physical environment of the policies and programs that are included in the plan, and recommends mitigations if unavoidable impacts are discovered. And that's where the issues about traffic and utilities and all that kind of stuff gets worked out, and that's an engineering exercise. And we're coordinating our work with the environmental work, but that's on a separate track. The acute lower income really gets to and it's not embodied yet in the state code, and it may show up, because the one thing I can tell you will happen is that the state legislature is meeting, and whenever the state legislature is meeting, this target moves on these these housing elements. We've had to react to a lot of last minute changes that just before the deadline, and when they change, we'll work them through with you. And this is a concept of looking at the real sort of needs of that indigent population, because as we saw when we were looking at the lower income categories in Marin County, some of those incomes are associated with are in fact quite high, right? Approaching and over $100,000. This is a question of what do you do for the truly indigent parts of your community and population that our low income is not providing us enough detail. And so we'll see how that evolves. And again, as we get feedback from the community to understand what that's a priority, programs can be designed to address the needs of that segment of the population.
And Peter, I would just add to that a little bit to say the constraints analysis that we do in the housing element document itself is more about spatial availability. So not in the same sense as a CEQA environmental analysis that's left to the actual CEQA document that David was talking about. The constraints that are identified within the document are talking about mostly concerned with, you have spatial constraints related to slope failures or, you know, whatever it might be, whatever natural occurring environmental factor that there might be. So obviously related, but slightly different analysis or slightly different lens through which that information is analyzed.
All right, we're going to try Susan Stomp again. Susan, I'm going to allow you to talk. And if you can unmute yourself. I can see that you're unmuted, Susan, but we still can't hear you. Okay, we'll come back to Susan. And we will move to Laura Giacomini. So Laura, you're ready to go?
Hello, everyone. Oops, my video is not showing. Is that supposed to happen?
Anyway. No video for attendees.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Anyway, I'm a little confused how your process is coinciding with the county process, who's already identified sites in Novato, and there's been a lot of feedback about that. And so how is this working conjointly together?
Yeah, Laura, the sites that the county has identified are not within the city limits of Novato. So they're in unincorporated area of Novato. They've been sort of called out as Novato sites, but they're actually in the unincorporated area. So they're on their own. The county's on they have the same mandates that we have. So they're on their own track for their element update.
Okay, Laura has a follow-up question here.
Are you going to be sharing the documentation that you shared tonight with us?
We can definitely post the PowerPoint if that's what you mean. We'll definitely put that on the website.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we'll next go to Emily Larson. So Emily, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening. I'm Emily Larson, and I live in Novato, and I love it here. Thank you for the presentation tonight. I'm just wondering, I joined about 15 minutes too late, so I apologize if this was covered. Is the city going to be exploring the affordable housing overlay that they used in the last housing element to apply a housing overlay over a site that may have an existing structure or existing like infill that may be zoned for something differently? Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Emily. We will be looking at all of those things. We expect to have the similar overlay tool that we have in the current element. Exactly what that looks like, we haven't detailed that or settled that out yet because we don't have a final list of sites. But I think it's safe to assume that some of those sites will be, you know, quote unquote redevelopment sites, meaning that they would have to be, you know, rebuilt or remodeled under a new zoning or under a new overlay. I hope that answers your question, but if you have follow-up, I'm happy to answer that.
Okay, at this point, I don't see any other hands raised. Oh, we have a hand up now. So next we have Karen Andreessen. So Karen, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, so assuming that this plan at Fireman's Fund that could be, if that passes with 1,000 new homes, would that be half of the requirements then for the 2,090? And then the second question is to follow up on what Laura said. With the county, they're proposing putting pretty much a vast majority of the Novato units at the Buck Center site. And I know some of that is in on city property. So how would those need to be coordinated if they're right next to each other?
So Karen, a couple of things there. Yes, the Development on Fireman's Fund, that is an active application, so we do get to count that toward our RENA. So yes, it's an important site for, there's no final unit count on that because they're still in process, but assuming it comes in somewhere around 1,000 units, it will, you know, definitely be an important project for meeting our RENA. At the Buck Center, there portions of the property are in the City of Novato, and any housing development assumed on those sites or applied for would be processed under City of Novato regulations, development standards, et cetera, and would go to the Novato City Council. There are also sites that the county has identified around the Buck Center that, as with some of the other sites that we've all heard about and read about, are in the unincorporated area, and those would get processed under county regulations. The county typically, and the City of Novato does the same, we refer projects to one another when they are in process. If we think there's some issue that is important to the county, or if it ties to a road network, for example, that is in the unincorporated area, we refer projects to them for comment, and they do the same to us. So when the actual projects came in, we would get a chance to see with specific applications where does that site take access? How is it related to city streets? Where is it? How is it, you know, just from a design perspective relating to the Buck Center or future housing projects at the Buck Center that are in the City of Novato. So, so again, we plan for what's in the city limits, and they plan for what's in the unincorporated area. And then some of the specifics of, does it work well together? Those happen later on with specific project applications.
All right, so I'm not seeing any other hands up at this point. Oh, we have another one. Lucy Hollingsworth.
Good evening. I was just wondering, thanks so much for the presentation and getting this process started. Will the community have an opportunity to also weigh in and have discussions about policies and programs to affirmably further fair housing? Will these sort of meetings be kept separate, or as opposed to site selection? How do you plan on organizing that? Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. David, do you want to?
Yeah, so for the protected classes in affirmatively furthering fair houses, we will undertake an active outreach to those communities. And it'll be largely done through the nonprofit sector where appropriate. But there's a requirement, again, that there's active outreach in AFFH. So what that ends up happening is it's a little bit of a parallel effort to the broader community efforts. So they support and supplement that, where we go out and we'll solicit input from community organizations and nonprofits that interface or provide services to members of the protected classes.
And Lucy, I would just add to what David said by calling out within our work plan. We have our, let's see, it's the first study session that will happen with the Planning Commission that was set up strategically to have to come after the focus groups and the community survey. So at that time, we'll be able to put together kind of unmet needs of the protected classes. And at that workshop or that study session, we'll be able to present at least preliminary information. And that would be a good opportunity to unearth anything that we haven't seen or to refine what we've heard into actual policies or programs. So that workshop, right now we have it targeted for the end of June.
Okay, we have Lucy Hollingsworth with a follow-up question. Lucy, you can unmute.
Sorry, and that workshop, that study session, that's open to the community?
Yes, yes, it is.
Thank you.
Okay, no other hands up at this time. Is there anybody else who would like to speak? If so, use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen.
And just real quick, Susan, if we're not able to fix your technological issue, you're welcome to email that housingelement@novato.org, and we can set up a call, or you can email me your questions or comments, and I'm happy to respond that way.
Okay, we have a hand up here for Madeline Kellner. Madeline, you can unmute yourself.
All right, it's actually Clint.
I have a question. I'm concerned about the expansion of the city boundaries over time and going into the, I guess we have an urban growth boundary. So as time goes on and we get more and more RHNA numbers over time, would it benefit the city to have as many housing in the housing allocation sites as possible at the front end, like now at this point in time? Or it seems to me it would. That way it would relieve pressure on expanding and pressure on open space. And then I guess a second question, but maybe it should be to the county. If the county has lands outside of the city boundaries, they could, I guess, expand into the urban growth boundary, or maybe they're already expanding into that. So those are my questions right now.
Okay, thank you, Clint. If I understood your question correctly, you're asking if it would be beneficial with the goal of preserving open space, whether it would be beneficial to be allocated more units now rather than future cycles, is the way I understood your question. If that's not what you meant, we'll definitely let you have a follow-up here. The answer to that question, unfortunately, is it doesn't matter. One of the frustrating things for all of us, and especially planners, is that the state process does not take into account capacity within your existing general plan. In other words, the allocation that David mentioned earlier, which begins at the state level, is looking statewide at what is the projected housing need and where are we right now in terms of housing units, and therefore how many do we need to plan for. That's done with every cycle, and it's a brand new evaluation based on current jobs data. So it doesn't relate to the ultimate capacity that any one city has. It's a mandate that you have to plan for it, whether that was your intention to or not. So if you have an urban growth boundary, that means you are densifying within your limit. And then I'm sorry, I forgot that big long-winded answer. I forgot the second part of your question. Clint, would you mind restating it, please? Steve, did you happen to catch it?
I'm checking my notes here, and I think it was a question regarding can the County of Marin, as it looks at its housing sites, either now or in the future, expand into the urban growth boundary?
Well, you're probably the best one to answer that, Steve, if you want to.
Yeah, so the city's urban growth boundary is a voter-approved ballot initiative. And so the urban growth boundary as it sits now is generally coterminous with the city's urban or the city limit line. So certainly the county doesn't have jurisdiction within the city. There are, I believe, 3 expansion areas, and I don't have the map in front of me, where the urban growth the urban growth boundary is coterminous with the city limit line. It's the actual city sphere of influence that has areas that are outside the city limit. And the sphere of influence is managed by LAFCO, so that's not something the city has control over. And those lands do in fact lie in the County of Marin. So short answer is no, the county cannot come into the urban growth boundary area because that is coterminous with the city's limit line.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, is there anybody else who would like to ask questions or make comments? Okay, I'm not seeing any at this point.
Okay, let's do a quick round of the panelists. David, does anybody on your team have anything to add?
I just want to say how pleased we are to be in Novato and to hear more about your experience with housing in the community, and to help us to fill in our quantitative understanding with a better understanding of how the community works so that we can produce the best possible plan for you.
Great, thank you, David. Okay, I see there aren't any other hands raised at this time. So we got a couple of good questions in there, several good questions. I think it was a good suggestion to put the PowerPoint. I also, I see this data all the time, but putting it together the way David had it, you know, drove home some facts to me. So I think that is a valuable education piece for everyone. So we'll be sure to get that up on the website along with this meeting recording. And everyone, just again, we're now far enough along in our technical work and our background work to really have this discussion. So invite everyone to regularly check that website. As we said, feel free to email that email address with questions, suggestions, ideas, etc. You'll see the graphic for the public outreach. You'll see that on the website as well. That gives you a broad overview of where we are in the process. And then watch for meeting announcements with the Planning Commission or on that Housing Element webpage if it's a workshop type format. So just check it periodically against that outreach graphic or calendar, and you'll be able to stay tuned in. And again, if you have suggestions for folks that you think may not be tuned in and we could benefit from hearing from them, we'd really love to have that feedback as well. So with that, again, want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight, and we'll look forward to future meetings. All right. Thanks, everybody, and good night.